will I get a legit evaluation, or will they just think I'm depressed? You cut out gaming and then you just replace it with other crap. People think that is a particular thing that makes them bored. No, your mind is in a pro-boredom state. Okay, this is a great question. I see you keep flaming therapy. Is there a situation in which therapy is the right move? What alternatives do you recommend? Ways to give back to the community. So, you're welcome to get involved with us. So we're as we're training coaches and stuff, what's happening in the brain when you all of a sudden stop enjoying games and actually prefer doing more productive things? Is it still about dopamine levels? Do you find spirituality conflicts with scientific research? Not at all. So let me be clear about a couple of things. Would I say I'm enlightened? No. At what age? It hasn't happened yet. I have a question. If I try to get professional help for video game addiction, will I get a legit evaluation, or will they just think I'm depressed? I really think I have an emotional dependency on games, and I use them to evade bad feelings to the point that I can't get things I need to get done. Okay, so will you get a legit evaluation, or will they just think I'm depressed? So you will get a legit evaluation, and they will probably think that you are depressed. So the first thing to understand is that very few mental health professionals understand video game addiction or how video games affect psychology or neuroscience, and that's not their fault. Right? Like when we were training, like in my training, I got over the course of 4 years and about 12 to 15,000 hours of training, I got a grand total of 0 hours of training on video game addiction. And that is, of all places, at the Harvard Medical School. And so the first thing you guys need to understand is if you're going to seek a mental health evaluation, it's not their fault that they don't understand video games. It's not, no one has been trained to ask, are you addicted to video games? So that's the work that I'm trying to do with the American Psychiatric Association. So I'm putting together a continuing medical education, like a class for psychiatrists, to educate them about video game addiction, to try to get them, I teach at various places, to try to raise awareness so that people do start asking about it. But I think if you want to get proper help, I think it is your responsibility to share this with them. If you share this sentence with them, you walk in and you say, hey, you talk to them, they're going to ask you, so what's bringing you in? They're going to all ask that question. They're like, what's bringing you in today? They're going to ask this open-ended question about why you're coming to see them. And if you say, I really think I have an emotional dependency on video games and I use them to evade bad feelings to the point that I can't get things I need to get done, that's all you need. That's the perfect answer. They should be able to handle that. Because remember that what psychiatrists and psychologists and therapists are good at is not necessarily understanding the nuances of a particular addiction. Like if you go see me, for example, so I'm an addiction psychiatrist and I work with people who have cocaine addictions. But I don't know the ins and outs of using cocaine and what it does. I'm not an expert. I've never even tried cocaine, so I don't really know anything about it. But I can absolutely help them with their emotional dependency on it and how they use it to evade bad feelings to the point that I can't get things done. Because that's not specific to video games, right? That's just normal. That's what we deal with. A therapist should be able to help you explore your emotional dependency on video games, should be able to help you explore what it is that you're using your video games to emotionally avoid, because we do that for all kinds of stuff. We watch TV, we engage in unhealthy relationships, we use substances of abuse. All of that stuff happens all the time, and psychiatrists should be able to handle that. So I don't think you're going to get a super knowledgeable person about video game addiction and what it does to you. But I think that's something that you have to kind of educate them about and that you guys can kind of work on together. And I think you can get help. I think you just can't, if they say I think you're depressed and then I think you should push back on that. You can say yeah, but I really think video games are my problem, in that it may look like depression. And so I think it's very important if you're with a therapist that you say what is on your mind, because that's what really helps them. If you just say what's on your mind, even if you disagree with them, that should be fine. And if they don't listen to you, then you should find a different therapist. Unfortunately, some of them, not all of them are perfect. So, thoughts on coronavirus? Yeah, I think coronavirus is bad, man. I don't know, what is going on in China where, they're having all these, really bad viruses break out. I'm not quite sure. There's some kind of public health issue there where they're breeding bad viruses. I don't know if it's because of the way that they keep their chickens or what, because there's so little information about what's going on. But it's like that, like it's not a coincidence that, you know, like SARS, the coronavirus, and like other public health catastrophes are like coming. Like when you have public health catastrophe after public health catastrophe come out of a particular country, like that's a problem, right? So they have something within their system of reporting, or the way that they treat things, or the way that they house, because these are all zoonotic infections, right? That's important to remember as well. So these are all like I think most of them are coming from poultry. So I think they've probably got something going on in terms of like the way that they're handling zoonotic stuff. So let's use a comparison. So mad cow was a big deal, you know, like a decade or more ago. And we haven't really heard much about mad cow. Mad cow, by the way, is absolutely terrifying. If y'all don't really know what it is, it's a terrifying concept in medicine. And mad cow isn't like as big of a deal now. Like we don't hear about continual mad cow outbreaks. I'm sure there are conspiracy theorists out there who say that, oh, there are outbreaks happening all the time. But the truth is that like people have made, I think the UK and the US have implemented like very strong, although if you really look at it, kind of terrifying levels of oversight, like, and it isn't how little oversight there is, but they've implemented sufficient oversight to prevent further outbreaks of mad cow, which is really, really great. So my question is, I don't know what China's public health policies are. I don't know if it's just they're unlucky, but like, I think it's interesting. And, you know, you have to wonder why there are multiple zoonotic bird related infections that are like killing people in China. Is it so bad because they just don't have the infrastructure to support the health? Like, I don't know what's going on, but I think from a systems perspective, like that's problematic. That's what I think. I was wondering if you could advise on recovering from dopamine exhaustion. I'm finding that once I cut out gaming, I tend to randomly browse the internet and watch shows when I would rather be developing productive hobbies and habits. Okay. So fantastic. You and everyone else, myself included, right? So like, it's not just about cutting out gaming. So this is a big important point. So we'll talk about dopamine exhaustion in a second. The first thing to understand, like the whole reason that we did Healthy Gamer, like why is it called Healthy Gamer? Is because I don't think gaming is actually the problem, right? So people who take an abstinence approach to gaming, abstinence-only approach to gaming, like for some people it's very successful, but like what I think is way, way more common than someone cutting out gaming and then transforming their lives is this. You cut out gaming and then you just replace it with other crap. So you got to get to the root of why you're gaming in the first place, right? You have to build a healthy life for yourself. What are the emotions that you're avoiding through gaming? Because you can stop the gaming, but your brain is going to find other way to avoid the emotions. And you'll browse Reddit and watch TV shows to avoid your emotions. You will find a way to procrastinate if you really want to procrastinate. Your mind is really good at procrastination. Your mind is really good at avoidance. So cutting out gaming is a good and significant step, but I think it's like a Band-Aid. It's like looking at the symptom of the problem instead of the root. The root is like, what is it in your life? Why aren't you moving forward in life? What are you trying to avoid? And what are you like afraid of about forward momentum? So we had an interview a couple weeks ago with Krusif, and he was kind of talking about having an invisible wall. Like when he tries to make progress, he runs to an invisible wall. And I was surprised to discover that his invisible wall, it's a great interview, by the way, isn't actually a wall. It's actually himself holding himself back. So when he starts to make progress, like if he gets a job, like he quits it after 7 days, but on day 3, he starts to like not want to go. And like, that's where the money is. And so a bizarre thing that happens is like the better he does in life, the more his depression happens. And I'd be wondering like how common that pattern is. So the question is, you know, what is it that the gaming is actually protecting you from? And if you can deal with those feelings of shame or fear or social anxiety or whatever, like then you don't need shows on the internet, right? Because this is a game of whack-a-mole. I see this also in people who have borderline personality disorder, eating disorders, and substance use. There's a group of people that I work with that all have all 3 of those things. So they have an eating disorder. They have something called BPD, so they do self-harm behaviors, and they have problems with substances like alcohol. So this is like the sort of the textbook example of this. Like the question that you're going to see if you take a medical board exam is like a 17-year-old girl who cuts, uses alcohol, and is underweight. And what we find when we treat these people is if you can control one of them, the others get worse. And if you can control two of them, the last thing gets worse. So if you stop them from self-harming and cut out the alcohol, their eating gets worse. If you force them to eat or you engage in like anorexia treatment and you stop them from drinking, then their cutting gets worse. And if you do anorexia treatment and stop them from cutting, then their drinking gets worse. So like it's a game of whack-a-mole, and it can be really frustrating and engender a lot of difficult dynamics between you and the patient. But the issue here is that like all three of those are coping mechanisms to deal with negative emotion. Cutting is actually a coping mechanism. It's almost like a meditative practice when you really talk to people about it. It's not, they're not trying to actually hurt themselves. It's just the pain focuses their mind and like relieves them of emotional tension. If you talk to people who engage in self-harm behaviors, that's actually how they describe it. And so the cool thing is that they get better when you start teaching them things like meditation. So when you teach them meditation, they have something else that they can go to for that emotional relief. So you can play whack-a-mole with Netflix, Reddit, and gaming all you want to. And gaming, I do think, is like more insidious because it engages our brain in a more profound way than, let's say, Reddit or Netflix does. Like, you have no sense of like online identity or accomplishment when you're, well, maybe when you browse Reddit and you get upvoted. Well, see, there you go. That's why Reddit's addictive. So like Netflix is the least addictive. It sounds like Reddit is a little bit more addictive, and gaming is even more addictive. So the issue is what's at the root. Now, the second thing is this person is talking about dopamine exhaustion. There's got to be like YouTube videos on our channel about this, I hope. If not, then I'll make one. But this is just a general concept that's important to understand in terms of playing a lot of video games. When I work with people who play excessive video games, they talk about like being bored. And if you really ask them like what they hate the most and what they're trying to avoid more than anything is not any kind of emotion or anything like that, is boredom. They hate boredom. And when they stop trying to play games, they feel bored. And so I feel like the biggest enemy, like the biggest challenge is just straight boredom. Like that's the challenge. It's not some complicated psychological, your dad did this, or you're afraid of death, or, you know, it's not anything like that. It's just boredom. So let's think about what boredom is. And we're going to jump to the interview in about five minutes, okay? So, when you play video games, your mesolimbic circuit of your brain releases something called dopamine. And the mesolimbic circuit of your brain that's one of the dopamine circuits that governs pleasure and reward. So there are other dopamine circuits, for example, that regulate movement and things like that. So people who have Parkinson's disease, they also have a dopamine shortage in their brain. So there are dopamine does a lot of stuff in your brain. It's not just pleasure and reward, but the mesolimbic circuit is devoted to pleasure and reward. So when you play a video game, you dump a lot of dopamine on a regular basis in your mesolimbic circuit with spikes of high reward. So if we take a drug like cocaine causes a large amount of dopamine to be dumped into your reward system like very quickly, whereas gaming is like slow, steady dopamine with spurts. And that's why you can play a game for like 12 hours, and then there are like moments in the game where you feel super excited and it's very kind of activating and engaging. So how does the body respond to constant stimuli? It responds by something called tolerance. And so what tolerance is like if you drink caffeine every day, like at first it kind of wires you and can keep you up all night. But if you drink enough of it, your brain actually down-regulates caffeine receptors. And what that means is it numbs itself to the signal of caffeine. So when you needed to drink 1 cup of coffee and that would have kept you wired through the night, if you drink coffee every day, like 1 cup of coffee isn't going to keep you wired because your brain has kind of numbed itself to the effects of caffeine. And so if we look at gaming, people who game a lot, their brain also adapts. Same principle. So it numbs itself to dopamine. And that's what I call dopamine exhaustion. You just like run out of dopamine, and the dopamine doesn't have really much effect. And your body, it's really a tolerance principle, and then you kind of, so things like become less fun. So then if you stop gaming, so gaming, remember, is like a steady stream of dopamine with spikes. But then if you try to do something like reading a book just releases less dopamine than playing a video game does. And so when people start to try to do other things, they find them boring. And the reason they find them boring is because your brain has built up such a tolerance to dopamine, it's numbing that signal of enjoyment. That's literally why everything is boring. Because your brain numbs the sensation of reward and pleasure. Because you've dumped so much dopamine into your mesolimbic circuit that's how your brain's going to adapt. So what you need to do is just understand that for 2 weeks, if you cut out gaming, you're going to be bored. You're going to be really bored. And that over time, that boredom is going to go away in and of itself. And this is the problem that a lot of gamers make, is they conclude that the activity is what's boring, right? You remove yourself from the equation. You're like, oh, I don't like to read a book. Books are boring. I don't like to garden. Gardening is boring. I don't like to go fishing. Fishing is boring. I don't like to work out. Working out is boring. I don't like to go to my job. Job is boring. I don't like to go to my classes. Class is boring. So you associate boredom with the activity without acknowledging that your neurochemistry is actually what's causing it boring. When you find your job, class, fishing, working out, gardening, and reading all boring, that's not everything in the world being boring, that's you, right? So you have dopamine exhaustion. So what you need to do is stop exposing your brain to dopamine for a long time. So take a period of like 2 weeks, do something like a gaming cleanse, and just understand that for 2 weeks, I'm not going to be sad. I'm not going to be shamed. I may have low energy level, but the main challenge that you have to survive 2 weeks of boredom. And if you survive 2 weeks of boredom, something magical happens. All of those things that you used to be boring then start becoming fun. And then the even more magical thing happens. What gamers want more than anything else is to enjoy the things that they should do. Gamers look at themselves and they say, oh, like, I like playing video games and I find school boring. I wish I was like those people who found school fun. Because if I found school fun, they enjoy it, then I could study, and then I could get a job, and then I could take control of my life. I wish I was like those people. Well, here's the thing. You can be like those people. You can literally do it. All you have to do is alter your neurochemistry through a 2-week gaming cleanse. 30 days is better. And as your brain rewires and recalibrates, and as your tolerance level goes down, then you're going to enjoy things better, and then you will become the very thing that you wanted to be. And once you become that thing and you enjoy school, that means you're going to do better in your classes. That means you're going to graduate. You're going to enjoy working out more. Your motivation, that intrinsic motivation that most gamers are missing, will start to come back. And as it comes back, that's how you become a healthy gamer. That's my whole point, is that as you build things in your life that you also find enjoyable, you're living a healthy and fulfilling life, and then you also get to play video games. The crazy thing is, this is even the best part, the games even become more fun. The gaming becomes more fun minute to minute, hour to hour, when the rest of your life is in order. It gets better. Okay. I just watched the video with Reckful and hearing the 4 states of consciousness got me thinking, and apologies for what will probably turn out to be a wall of text. Apology accepted. Okay, so if you guys want to, y'all can go back and look at the video with Reckful. I also talked about this with Devin Nash on one of our earlier streams, about the different 4 states of consciousness and mind. It's a pretty interesting way to understand how your mind works. As gamers, do you know that feeling when you're completely immersed in a game and enter into sort of a trance, where your mind stops thinking and you become one with the character? Yes, I do. That's called a flow state. For example, when playing a shooter, you no longer even feel moving your mouse or pressing buttons or your keyboard. No thoughts or anything. You just automatically react to whatever's on screen, get in your groove, and just play. Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing, let's just pause here. So that's a flow state, right? So a flow state is a period of time where your mind is ultra focused and you lose some sense of self and you kind of become one with the activity. So in a flow state, your performance improves, you feel better, and you're not plagued with stuff like anxieties. I find that I perform exponentially better in that mindset, both in a game environment and when attempting to be productive. Yes, so this is correct. Okay, so let's pause this for a second. This is exactly what I'm saying. So your productivity has nothing to do with like whether it's a game or school or your cooking or whatever. The quality and state of your mind determines your productivity. It goes back to what we were saying last time about boredom. People think that is a particular thing that makes them bored. No, your mind is in a pro-boredom state. And if you can get into a flow state, it doesn't matter what you can do. You can be playing the music, you can be singing music, you can be hanging out with your kids, you can be gardening, you can be playing a video game. It all gets better. Everything gets better. And that's because you change, right? Like this is about, remember guys, like when you're playing the game of life, like you have a character and your character influences things. It's not just the environment. So like, it's like when your character goes into like, flow mode, you are going to perform better. It's like a buff to all of your stats and all of your skills. 20% improvement to all of your stats and all of your skills when you're in a flow state. Is that, actually it's way more than 20%. It's probably like 100%. Is that state of mind similar to the place I'm trying to enter when meditating? Yes and no. So the goal of this, the meditative mind, is to have consciousness with no mental activity. The goal of a flow state is to have either consciousness with one pointed and focused mental activity or focused mental activity without consciousness. That may actually be a flow state. I'm going to have to think about that and explore that myself. So the question is like, do you lose track of time and awareness of self when you're in a flow state? Because a flow state may be one pointedness of mind, not a variable mind with actually no consciousness. I'm not sure, or whether consciousness is there or not. And what I will tell you is, so I teach people how to get into flow states, and these include physicians, surgeons, investment bankers, professional gamers, NFL athletes. And I teach them and train them how to get into a flow state. And like I teach all of these different people because the activity doesn't matter, it's the state of mind that matters, right? So when I work with like an esports team, I teach them how to enter flow states so that like when they start to tilt and their anxiety like raises through the roof and it affects their performance, I teach them how to recalibrate their brains so that they get out of that state. So it's very similar to, and the way I teach that is by teaching meditation, and then we kind of do additional things as well. But meditation is a great way to facilitate flow states. Not exactly the same, but it's like moving you in the general ballpark. I've been chasing that state of mind since I break out of thought loops and just simply do. Very good. Does anyone else enter such a mindset when doing work? Absolutely. Very productive people do. Does anyone else even experience what I'm describing, or am I just crazy? No, you're not crazy. The reason that you feel like you're crazy is because this is a hard state of mind to duplicate, right? So you have these flashes of insight where you're in this state of mind and you're like, whoa, that was amazing. Like I played a better game, I'm able to study, and then you try to chase it, right? And you even said you chase it. The problem is that the act of chasing reduces the chance that you'll enter a flow state. So the more that you chase the flow state, the harder the flow state is to attain. And then you think you're crazy because it happens once, and it's like brilliant and wonderful. And then like you try to find it again and you can't find it again. So then you start to question yourself. You're like kind of gaslighting yourself. You're like, did that really happen? Is that really possible? Does this happen to other people? This is kind of weird. Because 90% of the time, or even 95% of the time, or 99% of the time, you're in the thought loop state where your mind is super active, because most of the time as we live our day, our mind is active. That's what it does. It's active. It's thinking about stuff. That's how we do it. And then rarely you enter a flow state kind of naturally. But that absolutely works for other people. And I'd say that the more successful people that I meet tend to enter flow states better. And if you think about like where I was when I was failing out of college and where I am now, like one of the biggest things that's changed is my ability to enter a flow state. So I consistently enter flow states, and that's what makes me successful, right? It's my state of mind. But this is what I keep telling people, like my personality hasn't changed. I'm still lazy. I still procrastinate. I still like watch the Leipzig Major instead of doing my work. But the difference is that I enter flow states on a pretty regular basis. And since I enter flow states, I tend to be productive enough, and I do well in life. So not crazy. So I'd say absolutely try to cultivate flow states. Then your question is going to be how, which is a fair question. So let me just think about how to teach you guys how to do. That's like a long thing though. I can't just explain that in 5 minutes beyond meditating, but I don't think that's sufficient. So let me think. I'm just going to have to add that. Like I have to, so we're developing a curriculum of like start to finish stuff about meditation and dharma and Ayurveda. So I'm going to have to add a segment on flow states and how to cultivate them. So I'm just going to have to make a mental note to do that. Okay. By the way, so you guys know sometimes I do what I just did and I pause on stream and I like stop doing whatever I'm doing. And sometimes when I'm talking to people, it's kind of awkward, but I'm going to say, I'm going to just think for a minute. That is literally me trying to go into like a little mini flow state. Like it's like me taking a step back and reducing my thought loops. And if I'm really, really desperate, then I'll really try to go into a flow state. Because if I'm desperate and I don't know what to think, like I literally, what that means is my brain is picking up on something that I cannot logically process. And it's too much. So I have to pause and I have to like get into the flow state and then something like some answer comes out. And that's part of what makes me effective. Like if you guys watch my interviews, we'll see if it happens today. So keep an eye out. So actually, this is what we should do today. So I want you guys to be more active viewers today, okay? I want you guys to watch me and try to see when I enter a flow state and when I don't. And try to see when is my thinking logical and when is it not logical. And just because it's not logical doesn't mean it's wrong. But I think you guys will be able to see some of the stuff that I do is logical and a product of the analytical mind. But some of it is not the analytical mind. And I'm trying to do like this crap. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. But like it's something like meditation, something like a flow state, something like intuition as opposed to analysis. And try to see if you can tell the difference. Okay? And then we'll talk about it a little bit after the interview. Okay, this is a great question. I see you keep flaming therapy. Is there a situation in which therapy is the right move? What alternatives do you recommend? So I think therapy is fantastic. So I was sharing with you guys my personal beefs with therapy, right? But that's like, I think it's important when you engage in a practice to understand its weaknesses. It doesn't mean that the practice is bad, right? You can also say that like college sucks for all kinds of reasons. It doesn't mean that college is bad, but college sucks because people are cliquish or like, you know, people, their fraternities, or like, you can say whatever you want to about things being negative. So I want to thank you for asking this question, because I think therapy is actually really good. And like I said, I recommended therapy to him. So I think that, you know, I was being critical of a therapist, which is really unfair because I didn't understand, you know, the therapist may have been making their judgment based on all of the information that Jake was sharing with them. So the therapist may be correct too. So it does sound like the dad is emotionally unavailable, to be fair, right? Because we can sort of infer that. It's not like rocket science. So it's kind of a dick thing for me to say. I think therapy is actually very good. I mean, I'm a therapist in my day job, so I think it's very effective. I think a lot of people could benefit from it. I think most people could benefit from it. But I think, like with anything that you do in life, you should understand what the shortcomings and downsides are, because that allows you to protect against them. So the funny thing is that I think that something like what we do on stream is a very good adjunct to therapy. So I think if you want to correct your life, you should meditate, watch stuff like this stream, work out, you know, watch like professional streams and stuff too. Like learn how to make a resume and go to therapy. I think it's actually oftentimes the right call. And very rarely is it the wrong call. What's your opinion on Kundalini Yoga? So I think Kundalini Yoga is an incredibly powerful spiritual practice that should be done under the guidance of a guru. So Kundalini Yoga can like literally make people go crazy. So I was talking a little bit, I don't know if I mentioned this, but there are case reports of meditation-induced psychosis. Meditation is also a practice that comes with risks. And Kundalini Yoga is actually one of the more riskier kinds of yoga. Now, if you go to like a yoga studio and they have a Kundalini Yoga class, that's not real Kundalini Yoga. That's all of that is hatha yoga, and it's all asana. Asana is yoga postures. So 99% or 95% of what they teach it in yoga classes, yoga studios, like in the West, is not true and authentic Kundalini yoga. So true and authentic Kundalini yoga involves a couple of things. Diksha, which means initiation. The second thing, so it involves asana. It also involves pranayam, so certain breathing practices. It also involves very specific dharanas, mudras, and bandhas. Dharana are specific meditation or focusing techniques. Mudras are particular hand signs or locks. And bandhas are locks. So you lock certain parts of your body to shift the flow of your prana. So true Kundalini yoga involves like all of that stuff. And if you do that without the guidance of a guru, like I really don't think that that's safe. But I think it's really powerful. So a big part of my personal practice very early on, and what I felt was somewhat transformative, was Kundalini yoga. Okay, hey Dr. K, just recently found your channel. I'm starting my internship this year and will soon be wrapping up my clinical psych PhD. As I move into my career, I think at some point it would be awesome to do something on the side that benefits the community I grew up in. A lot of MMOs and fighting games. Any suggestions for ways to give back to the community? Have you ever thought about collaborating with other mental health providers and professionals with this stuff? Yeah, so first of all, I think it's great that you're pursuing a psych PhD and that you want to give back to your gamer bros and girls, and everything in between. So I think ways to give back to the community. So, you're welcome to get involved with us. So we're as we're training coaches and stuff, we're exploring a lot of other kind of options. And I think if you're especially a trained psychologist, that would be cool. So you could try to help us because we're trying to help people and there are more people than I can help. And the second thing is, have I thought about collaborating with other mental health providers and professionals? Absolutely. So I have a couple of professional connections that are, all over the place. So like there are other therapists and psychiatrists that I talk to about the work that I'm doing. Some of them find me because their YouTube algorithms send me their way. And then I'm also trying to educate psychiatrists and soon to be psychologists about video game addiction and stuff like that. So I do some national stuff. I teach a lot through residency programs and through HMS. I'm doing stuff with the American Psychiatric Association. So I have like this whole academic side. Like part of the reason that I only stream like 6 or 7 hours a week is because, I do all this other kind of academic stuff, clinical stuff, things like that. And if you're interested in getting involved with that, we have a prospective collaboration with MIT going on. So we'll see how that goes, to actually like study neuroscience and things like that. So, if you're interested in getting involved in any of that stuff, reach out. I think we're going to try to add a link at the bottom for people who are interested in volunteering or getting involved. So, yeah, if you guys want me to quit and stream full time, I gotta get those sweet subs and hype trains, man. Dr. K has bills to pay. Do you think we shouldn't listen to music 24/7 because our minds are overstimulated? No, I think the bigger problem, well, I guess, yeah, maybe the answer is yes. So I'd be really curious why you listen to music 24/7. Like, what do you get? Like, if you're listening to something 24/7, aren't you basically drowning it out? Like, do you really listen to it? I mean, I find music to be incredibly impactful for my mental state. Like, I really like it to get me in the right kind of mood to work or facilitate a flow state or get pumped up. But I find that like you have to be intentional. I mean, if I intentionally listen to music, it pumps me up. If it's playing on in the background, it has less of an effect. So I listen to certain music before I stream, and I think it puts me in like a good mindset. And do I think your mind is going to be too stimulated? Yeah. So I think that you should give your mind a break from mental activity. So remember that your mind is sort of like a cow and likes to chew over things. So it's like, it wants to like chew cud and things like that. So it wants to like chew over things. So I think I found that in my life, like I noticed one day that, I would listen to I'd listen to audio lectures and stuff in the morning when I was in med school. And then on the train, I would listen to an audio lecture. Or when I was walking to the train, when I sat down on the train, I would study. I would listen to an audiobook or something like that when I get off the train and I'm walking to class, then I'm in class. And then like basically like the whole day, my mind was occupied by, audio lectures or audio books, which I listened to a lot of. And there was this phase in my life where I felt like I didn't want to waste a moment. I always wanted to be learning something. So a lot of audiobooks in between studying. And then I realized like, actually, my mind is just, I need to give my mind time to just be itself. Because I think something you guys have to remember is that, sure, you can learn a lot from other people and reading things and stuff like that, but do not underestimate what your mind can discover. So if you give your mind enough like space, it will process things and help you understand things and make discoveries of its own. It'll give you creative ideas. Like, just think about this for a second. Like, I don't know if you guys are Game of Thrones fans. I'm not talking about the show. I'm talking about the books. But, if you think about that, like, how did George R.R. Martin, like, his mind came up with that, right? If he was constantly listening to stuff and constantly occupying his time, he would not be able to create new ideas. New ideas and creativity require space for them to happen. And if you feel stuck in life, if you feel uninspired, part of that may be because you're not giving your mind the space to actually like figure out what it wants to do. So I think you should be careful about listening to music 24/7 and really try to understand what is it doing for you and what is it doing for your mind. What's happening in the brain when you all of a sudden stop enjoying games and actually prefer doing more productive things? Is it still about dopamine levels? The short answer is I don't know, and no one does, okay? The long answer is I don't think so. So I think that over time, if you feel stuck in life, or if you engage your mind in other ways, that's going to like create intrinsic motivations or pulls away from video games. The other thing that happens over time is that your frontal lobes and prefrontal cortex mature. So frontal lobes and prefrontal cortex are responsible for impulse control and being able to delay gratification. So when you're like a 5-year-old, your capacity to enjoy investing a lot of work and getting out of it versus an immediate reward is like really skewed. Like 5-year-olds don't get much accomplishment out of growing a tomato plant over the course of months and like getting value out of like getting that tomato in like when spring comes around, right? They don't have that capacity because their prefrontal cortex, they'll eat the tomato, they'll enjoy the tomato, but the idea of like invested work and like reaping those rewards is not something that their brain enjoys as much as like impulsive activities. As we grow older, so our IQ can top out relatively quickly, but our brain involves so much more than like analytical capability. So our frontal lobes develop until about the age of 30, and some people even say like 32, 35. I suspect in gamers they actually continue to develop because they're like sort of delayed in their development until like 32 to 35. And so a lot of that change in enjoyment is because as your frontal lobes develop, your capacity to enjoy activities that involve delayed gratification and your sense of accomplishment from a hard day's work is actually changes. So that's just one circuit in addition, or one neuroscientific principle that in addition to dopamine can explain your response. But I think there's all kinds of other stuff that goes on. Like other kinds of psychological things and stuff like that. But the short answer is it's complicated and no one really knows. But I do think it's way more than dopamine. And the simplest thing is, as you grow older, your capacity to delay gratification and enjoy high investment activities increases. Dr. K, I've noticed quite a few references. So we'll do like 2 more questions, then we're going to wrap up, okay? Dr. K, I've noticed quite a few references to spirituality in the videos of yours that I've seen so far. Do you find spirituality conflicts with scientific research? Not at all. So let me be clear about a couple of things. So the reason that I talk about spirituality is because you guys ask for it, right? So the early phases of if you guys like go through our Healthy Gamer, like the original YouTube list, like the 12 videos for the first workshop that I did, and we've got about 25 other videos that are just collecting dust. I talk very little about spirituality. It's all psychology, neuroscience, well referenced. The interesting thing, as I've started interacting with my community, and as I've started streaming, what I see. So let's just take our what I see is like what's missing is not the science. It's like the stuff that we call spirituality. So if we think about our last interview with Jake, we can talk. So we did a lot of like psychology stuff at the beginning. We talked about emotions. We talked about alexithymia. We helped him find his emotions. And that's like, that helps him, but it's not like the full story for him, right? The full story for him, I didn't feel like the interview was complete until we talked about dharma. So I think what's missing and what people ask for is like, I mean, the most questions that I get are about dharma. And so that's what's missing. You guys lack purpose. It's not just depression and anxiety. And that's also why this isn't therapy, because therapy is about treating depression and anxiety. It's about diagnosing and treating a particular condition. This goes beyond that, right? Like, we started with some psychology, and then like we absolutely moved on to spirituality with the end. So I'm talking more about spirituality because that's what I'm sensing people need. And science, I mean, I think they're both great. I don't think they conflict at all. So I think that over time, science and spirituality are going to get closer and closer and closer together. So the more that we understand, let me just think if I can find a good example of this. So this is going to be kind of a stretch, but how to explain this? Because there are just some assumptions that we take for granted, which we think are logical and scientific, but are not actually logical and scientific. So let's talk for a second about, okay, so this may not make much sense, and I have to probably formulate this argument better, but I'm going to just try. So karma is a spiritual concept, right? Like, people think about karma or karma as a spiritual concept. It's not a scientific concept. But if you really look at the definition of karma, all karma means is cause and effect. Karma just says that there are causes and there are effects. And that if you see an effect now, there is a cause in the past that explains why things are the way that they are. That is really all the theory of karma says. That's the essence of the theory of karma. And so we look at that and we say, okay, the theory of karma is kind of like not scientific, right? You can look at something like physics, and then as people discovered so yogis have been saying that all effects are preceded by causes for thousands of years. Before we understood like Newtonian physics, that was not accepted within the scientific community. Newton was the one who discovered like the laws, his laws of physics, which is that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That became science, and we now all accept that as true, but after Isaac Newton. But before that, karma was saying that all along. Like, karma and Isaac Newton are saying like basically the same thing. And now we just assume that that's scientific. So in our minds, a concept that used to be under the umbrella of spirituality has now been moved to scientific because of scientific exploration. Right? Like, that's what's happened. Now we regard that concept as not spiritual anymore, but as scientific, even though it's been talked about by spiritual people for thousands of years. So here's the next example of that, is genetics. So people said, okay, fine. In the realm of physics, we can say that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. But when someone is born a particular way, is that random? And the answer is no, that the genetics, and now we sort of all accept genetics, we all understand genetics, but you have to like think of, like, put yourself in the shoes of someone like in the 1800s and like how radical of a concept genetics is. That your physical form is not determined by, like, is determined by like something that is like not under your control at all and has nothing to do with this life, like your choices or anything like that. That genetics is essentially like the process of some cause that creates a particular effect. And that's kind of like a no-brainer, right? Like, that's like a no-brainer. Like, duh, like genetics means that my hair is black because both my parents have black hair. But that was actually like a relatively revolutionary concept, like over 100 years ago. And karma has sort of implies that, and you can make an argument that karma doesn't imply that, and that's a fair argument. We can go down that road. But I think that actually what's happening is that the more we investigate science, the more we're finding scientific validity for certain spiritual concepts. So I'll give you guys sort of the last example, which we don't fully understand yet. So I talk a lot about dharma. Dharma is duty or responsibility. And it's my belief that dharma is the thing that allows you to face difficult things in life and choose the right thing despite it being hard. So in addiction psychiatry research, what we've realized is that for people to quit an addiction, so people took a bunch of people who were addicted to substances and then tried to understand how is it that one person is able to quit and another person is unable to quit. So we did qualitative and quantitative research on people who were addicted to substances, and we tried to look for the sweet secret sauce. Like, where's the magic? Like, what is it that allows one person to overcome alcoholism and another person to not overcome alcoholism? And the answer is something called a competing interest. Or that's not the answer. It's one of the variables, right? There are a lot of variables we don't know. And so competing interest is like a good reason that makes it worth your while to quit the substance. And that is dharma. Like, that's the same thing. So like science talks about a competing interest. Yogis talk about dharma, and at the end of the day, a competing interest is dharma. It's like a good reason, a duty or a responsibility. And if you actually look at what are examples of competing interests, and I've talked about this before, but I'll give you guys an example. So I was like working with someone around smoking cessation, and I tried to inform them of all of the dangers of smoking cessation, like lung cancer, heart disease, stroke, etc. And as much as I educate them, week after week after week after week after week, they didn't quit smoking. And then one day I decided to be a dick, and I said, do you ever want to see your daughter graduate from college? Do you ever want to see her get married? And do you ever want to meet your grandkids? That got him to change, because that's his dharma. That's a competing interest. Same thing. So I don't think that spirituality and scientific research conflict at all. In fact, I think the more that we advance in scientific research, the closer we will validate certain spiritual concepts. And the reason I say certain spiritual concepts, this is very important, because I don't think all spiritual concepts are correct. I think as we investigate some, we will not find any evidence of them. And as we investigate others, we will see what's true and what isn't, because that's what's cool about science. Science tells us what's true. The thing that we have to be careful about, though, is that we have to understand that science is still progressing, and our capacity for science is still in its infancy in some areas, especially when it comes to psychology and neuroscience. Like, we understand, like, Newtonian mechanics pretty well. We're getting a better sense of things like quantum mechanics. We have a pretty good understanding of cardiac physiology. We have a pretty good understanding of endocrinology. We have less of an understanding of the immune system, less of an understanding of the brain, and even less understanding of psychology. Right? So what that means is that we have to remember that just because science has not discovered or validated a particular spiritual concept, is that concept related to something that is in the neuroscience or psychology realm? Because if so, we're going to suck at investigating that. So you have to remember that some spiritual concepts are going to be wrong, and that you shouldn't accept spirituality just for its own sake. That spirituality should and can be tested by science, but also that science has limitations. And that science is not going to be appropriately equipped to test for things like reincarnation. We just don't have the scientific capability of that yet. So is it logical to believe in it? Is it scientific to believe in it? Absolutely not. But it is my hope that one day we will progress science to the point of somehow being able to test reincarnation. Because if it is real, that means that science should be able to test it at some point. That's how the world works, right? And I know it sounds absolutely crazy today, but I think you guys just have to remember that like 1,000 years ago, we didn't understand how electricity worked. We sure as hell didn't understand the brain. We didn't understand we couldn't send someone to the moon 1,000 years ago. We couldn't send someone to the moon 200 years ago. Those would have been completely ludicrous. We didn't even know what the moon was 1,000 years ago. So it's like, there are things that sound absolutely ridiculous, and I understand that it sounds absolutely ridiculous. To be able to test reincarnation, like, what the F are you talking about? How do you even go about doing that? Short answer is, I don't know. I don't have any idea. But we should be careful not to have scientific arrogance that our capacity to test and understand the world right now is like anywhere close to complete. Because there's nothing that I've seen no evidence, although our capacity to understand is growing at an exponential rate, I have no idea where the asymptote is, if that makes sense to people. Like, I don't know, like, we could continue growing at this rate of scientific understanding for 2,000 years and be like 10,000 times as smart as we are today and still, like, not understand half of what goes on in the universe. So I don't think that those conflict at all. And what I actually really like is, like, what gives me a lot of personal, like, comfort and confidence is when there are scientific points that validate spiritual concepts. And in my personal life, and also, like, in my treatment, what I try to do is find the areas where spirituality and science overlap. And it's those things that I recommend the most, like, robustly. And the best example of that is every stream, I don't talk about Ayurveda. I don't talk about reincarnation. I sort of talk about Dharma because that's what you guys want. But what is the one thing that I recommend on every single stream? You guys know? Absolutely. And why is that? It's because there is overwhelming spiritual support for it and overwhelming scientific support for it. And let's remember, so meditation is the last example that I'll leave you guys with. Let's remember that meditation was thought is like hokey, silly stuff that yoga hippies did back in the 60s. It had no scientific validation. And so people assumed it was false because it had not been studied. And now, like, meditation is, like, there are just gigantic institutes that are studying the effects of meditation. So let's remember, let's be humble and not practice scientific arrogance. And remember that just because something has not been scientifically investigated does not mean it is false. So reincarnation is where meditation was 100 years ago. Just because we don't know how to study it and haven't tried does not mean it is false, which is one of the biggest mistakes that I see a lot of people who are, like, pro-science and anti-religion make. Right? It's like we haven't studied it appropriately. So am I asking you to believe in it? No. But it's just like we haven't studied it yet. Like, I don't even know how to study. Like, I don't even know how that works. But anyway, great question. Okay, last question. Would you say you're enlightened? If yes, at what age did it happen? And can you get more enlightened? Would I say I'm enlightened? No. At what age? It hasn't happened yet. And then can you get more enlightened? Sort of. So there are many stages of consciousness that apparently, like, you can purify. So there's like a level 1 enlightenment, level 2 enlightenment, level 3 enlightenment. If you read Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, he talks about some of this stuff. I'm not quite sure about all that stuff because I haven't experienced it and I haven't seen scientific evidence of it. So I don't really I don't talk about it much. So I've studied it and I can talk about it. But the things that I tend to rely on are things that are based on my personal experience or clinical experience and that which has scientific validation. So there's samadhi, which is a stage of temporary enlightenment. And then there are, like, other stages of enlightenment, supposedly after that. And then there's the complete enlightenment, which is at the end. And I just don't talk about it because I don't really understand it. And I'm not enlightened. So I think one good example of this is that I do think, for example, different stages of enlightenment or different faculties that they ascribe to enlightened people do map on pretty cool with, like, different parts of the brain. So I think as we understand this, people meditate, it's not just because enlightenment is sort of like a global level up, right? It's not like leveling up one skill. It's just like, it's like Super Saiyan form. It's like a different form of human being where everything is boosted. And that's what we actually see. So that's how spirituality and yoga describes enlightenment, or Tao or Buddhism. And we actually see that in science. That as you meditate, your attention gets better, your concentration gets better, your memory gets better, your capacity for empathy gets better, your narcissism goes down, your capacity to delay gratification gets better, your capacity for impulse control gets better. So if we really look at it scientifically, meditation is like a buff to everything, which is aligned with how people describe enlightenment. It's like a global improvement. And there are very few things in medicine that actually have global improvements, right? So, I mean, I think that meditation and spirituality and science are, like, not exclusive at all. In fact, I think it's the areas that they overlap, which gives you guidance on both. So if there's a scientific concept, if there's a spiritual concept which has no validation in science, then like it's less valuable than the ones that do have validation in science. Okay. Okay, guys. Thank you guys very much. We're going to go ahead and wrap up. And I just want to thank everyone. So I saw we had some gifted subs from an